After the Saxons invaded and occupied the country, they were later overrun by the Danes. And the Danes took up occupation right up to the time of King Harold. And he too was defeated by William of Normandy on that famous date we all know to be 1066. Now, when William had been in the country for some years and settled his feathers, to be precise, between the years 1083 and 1086, he ordered his Chancellor of the Exchequer to make an inventory of virtually every living thing in the country. He instructed him, however, not to list buildings or churches, because they can't be taxed. But he did give him instructions to list watermills and windmills, because their end product was a taxable commodity. Now, all these details were entered in what we all know to be the Domesday Book. Now, Melton is mentioned in the Domesday Book as Middletone. Now, as we see it here, there is a line stricken right through the word, but don't be alarmed at this. It was the method in those days by which they would emphasize a word, whereas today we would underline it. So there we have Middletone. Now, for the reasoning behind Middletone is because whilst we have no absolute positive evidence that the Danes had a settlement in Melton proper, we do know that they had settlements around Melton. We can tell this by the village or hamlet endings in BY, such as Saxby, Welby, Frisby, Wyfordby, Asfordby, and so on. And Melton, being in the middle of all these BY endings, we finish up with Middletown, or Middletone. Now, as for the remainder of the name, Mowbray, this comes from the de Mowbray family of the Normans, who occupied the position of Lords of the Manor for some 400 years. And there comes the third Lord of the Manor of Melton, namely Roger de Mowbray, who, upon his return from the Crusades in the Middle East, bequeathed several buildings in Yorkshire, and most of all for us here at Melton, he instigated the construction of the parish church of St Mary's the Virgin. He also endowed the building of the leper hospital at Burton Lazars. Later in years, his name was attached to Melton by royal warrant during the time of Edward I's Parliament. So there we have it. Middletone Mowbray, or Melton Mowbray. There's one thing I'll always say about this part of Melton Mowbray, Burton Street, Burton End, is this wonderful view of Anne of Cleves with the backdrop of the parish church of St Mary. It really is nice. It's taken on by artists and painters alike, visiting photographers, and it's a nice composition, makes a nice picture. However, what I think we ought to do now is, if we cross the road, we can then say a few words about the Anne of Cleves house. We're now outside the Anne of Cleves house. This old building was erected in the 14th century and it was built as a chantry house to house the priesthood. And at any given time, it would house 9 and sometimes up to 14 priests. However, it belonged to the church up until the time of the dissolution, when Henry VIII himself fell out with Rome over divorce matters and took the Church of England, shall we say, on his own shoulders. But what he did when he sequestrated this property, and the property we know as the Spinneys to the northeast of Melton, alongside what we know as Scawford Back Lane, he gave these lands and the house to his favourite advisor, who was Thomas Cromwell. Not to be confused with Oliver Cromwell, who came along 100 years later, but nevertheless the same family. Henry had sequestrated these properties, and at the same time thereabouts, his third wife, Jane Seymour, passed away 12 days after delivering him a son. That son was later to become Henry's follower, namely Edward VI. However, it wasn't long before Henry was looking around again for wife number 4, and we've got to remember that he was a bit of a wily devil, was Henry VIII, because he even married Anne Boleyn secretly before he divorced Catherine of Aragon. So certainly a gentleman to watch out for. Now, when he told Thomas Cromwell that he was looking for wife number 4, he said, "I would like a French wife." But he was then advised not to do so because he had already upset the French monarchy. But he did hear from Cromwell that a German princess was on the marriage market. She had recently lost her husband, Philippe Ludwig van der Pfalz, from Clever in Germany. And her name was Anna van Clever. In fact, this principality was a German principality, was needed badly by England because England at that time had no German allies. So Henry, thinking it was a good idea, saying, yes, if the young lady is available, let's see what the lady looks like. So instead of sending the painter Hans Holbein, who was a German incidentally, to paint her picture, you see, someone had to paint her picture because Henry didn't have a camera at the time. But they did in fact send a French painter, very little known, but his name was Antoine Caron. And he was smartly dispatched over to Clever to paint the lady's portrait. After they painted the portrait, it was shown to Henry, and he looked at it and he said, "Now that's my baby." Because, like all artists, every one of them have license to paint what they like or modify what they like, or put a tree in here or put a house in there. But this French artist, Antoine Caron, he seemed to have exceeded his license somewhat by making this rather dull, plain and, may I say, obese woman into something more beautiful and attractive. And Henry really liked it, so he said, well, okay, can I arrange to meet her? So the message got through to Anna van Clever, and she left Clever with her entourage of 30, all dressed in black for the simple reason that she had just lost her husband, Philip Ludwig van der Pfalz. However, she arrived at Calais and duly came over, and Henry met her at Greenwich. And then, what a surprise. Henry was introduced to her, and he said, "Oh my goodness me, whatever's gone wrong?" she looks like a horse. So from that time onward, poor Anne went down in history known as the Flanders mare. And it wasn't very long before he was engineering the divorce of Anna van Cleef and looking for wife number 5, which was Catherine Howard, of course. Now, the properties that he had sequestrated, they'd gone back to the Crown, that he sequestrated from the church, he had given them to Thomas Cromwell. Now, because he was so displeased with Thomas Cromwell, with the result of this this so-called marriage, he just went ahead, as Henry did, took the lands from him, chopped his head off, and that was the end of that. But when he then divorced Anne of Cleves, those properties went back to Anne in the divorce settlement. Anne of Cleves lived, in fact outlived, the next 2 wives of Henry VIII, namely Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, right up to the time of Elizabeth, in fact. And we don't know whether she in fact ever came to Melton Mowbray. Now, somehow these properties came onto the open market, and a John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, acquired these properties, and of course he leased the grazing lands out to the people of Melton Mowbray, and the house as a private residence. This was then purchased by an ex-Meltonian, a very rich man, made his money as a haberdasher in London and always had a love for Melton Mowbray. He came up here and purchased the lands from John Dudley. Now, this Christopher Draper, who now owned the lands, he let them to the people of Melton for grazing purposes, and then he sold the lands to the people of Melton Mowbray. And that was in 1549 and is assumed to be the start of the Melton Mowbray town estate. Quote the words in the book written by the Reverend John Ward in his 1882 publication, Melton Mowbray Town Estate, Its Origin and History. He says, "There is no town in the kingdom, considering its size and population, that is more favourably circumstanced as regards its local rights and privileges than Melton Mowbray. Yet it is indeed somewhat strange that the amount of people, or the residents of Melton Mowbray, living within the area of benefit, know little or nothing about the origins or history of this 450-year-old charity." The estate now owns and maintains the park, the play close, Edgerton Park, the Memorial Gardens, the All England Ground, the sports complex on Leicester Road, the Asferby Road Golf Course, and many acres of grazing land, numerous buildings in the town, and the cattle market. Now, here we are, ladies and gentlemen, outside the Melton Mowbray cattle market. Now, this market has been here for certainly 1,000 years. It's mentioned in the Domesday Book, and believe me, it's quite an activity in Melton Mowbray, having been held every Tuesday, as I say, for the past 1,000 years. The land proper belongs to the Melton Mowbray Town Estate and is leased by Melton Borough Council on a peppercorn long lease. The previous market that used to be held in Melton, the Beast Market, was always held outside the Limes in Sherrard Street. So there we go. Let's proceed inside now and see what we can find. It's quite amazing, isn't it, that the public know exactly what he's saying. However, let's proceed through to the other side and we'll have a look at the we'll have a brief look at the sheep pens. There's in the Beast Market, there's the bell's just been ringing, and if we move down there, we can watch an auction going through. You follow me, please. Come on. There you go. Now, how does anybody really understand what he's talking about?
Your name, mate. Your bloody name.
Us all. We take a walk now down Nottingham Street between the market stalls. It's a very pretty street. Can you hear the bells going now of the old corn exchange? And now we approach the old pork pie shop where they make today the most exquisite Melton Mowbray pork pie. The Half Moon, very pleasant mews yard up there of the Half Moon, very nice. Yes, it's really quite something when you consider that it's been here all that time. And there we have the porch and balcony of the Swan Inn. Unfortunately, it suffered a severe fire some years ago, but nevertheless, it's a good job done. It used to be the meeting place for the justices of Melton Mowbray. We're walking now along Church Street, one of the more pleasant of the mews, the back streets of Melton Mowbray. And here, the old building here on the left was the seat of the justices. There we go, you see, the old courthouse. Over there, between the obelisk and the tree, is the only thing left of the old club cafe, and that's the two bay windows. The rest, of course, was modified over the years. There we have the Blakeney Institute in front of us, now occupied by the Leicester Mercury. And the Collies Hall was opened by Her Grace the Duchess of Rutland. Well, there we are, Melton, the Meltonians at play, market day. Now how about we go into the grapes and have a pint of bitter. Nice to see you. See you coming out on a Tuesday. Now, landlord, could I order a couple of pints of something?
You certainly can.
Melton Mowbray, at the turn of the century, had no less than 47 public houses and ale houses, which, unfortunately for us, is far too numerous to mention. But I will take you for a walk along Sherrard Street and point out one or two of those that have gone by. For example, this building here was the Black's Head, a rather unique building in so much that the front facade was in green glazed tiles, and each of the tiles were moulded, each with a character in of the Black's Head. Now that must be an expensive way of presenting a public house, but there we go. Let's press on further. We're approaching now Woolworths, and along this stretch here, commencing about here, there used to be a 7'6" high wall which was in front of the Jacobean house, the Limes at that time. It was a very beautiful property. There we see over on our right the old post office. Now this wall along the Limes would traverse all the way along here to the corner of Windsor Street and Sherrard Street. Now over here where we see the central arcade, there used to be a public house called the Wheat Sheaf, and when it's lost its licence, the licence was transferred to the Wheat Sheaf Inn on Thorpe End. Over there, look on my right, we see the Black Swan. I'm sure Mr. Brown won't mind if I use the words mucky duck, which is what most Meltonians call that public house. Here we come to Pearce and Sons, the jewellers, and this was the site of the Bishop Blaise, named after Bishop Blasius. I remember this when Mr. Buckminster was the last landlord. Now just through here, where we see those houses, stood a beautiful mansion house called the Elms, and it had such a huge garden area around it, really beautiful. And the area behind there, William Hills now, is Elms Road, of course, named after it. Now here's something which I find rather interesting, and that is we're just approaching Sage Cross Street. Now Melton Mowbray had 7 crosses: Thorpe Cross, the Sheep Cross, the Butter Cross, and so on. I can't bring them all to mind at the moment, but there was one here, the Sage Cross. Now it isn't there, and yet it is there. But it was never removed. It was more, the earth was taken away from underneath it and the cross went down into the ground. So as far as we all know, it's still there. Melton Mowbray had been well endowed over the centuries with windmills and watermills. Although this windmill is in a somewhat of a dilapidated state, it's, to me, nevertheless got a certain charm about it. And when we look at Melton Mowbray as a whole, we had 3 windmills, one being at the top of Scorford Road near the site of the Catherine Daly House. We had another one at the top of Burton Road near the Homestead, and then we had 3 here on Dolby Road, one at the very top of Dolby Road and 2 exactly here at the junction of Dolby Road and Leicester Road. The watermills, we had 3 watermills. One was at Rhubarb Island, and the other 2, one at Beck Mill near the Rugby Joinery Company, or formerly known as the Midland Woodworking Company, and the 3rd one was at the junction of the River Eye and the Scorford Back Brook. Now the mills were built on this slope due to the prevailing winds, which kept the mills turning for most of the working day. Growers were, I would describe them as somewhat kindly toward the less better off Meltonian, in so much that they would allow what we call gleaning, which is to allow remaining corn to be picked after a field has been harvested. And that would of course be ground for free for the Meltonians themselves. In fact, it was so powerful at one time that it was a punishable offence to grind one's own corn. The town crier of Melton Mowbray would announce which field was to be gleaned next, and a bell would be rung at 8 o'clock in the morning when gleaning may commence, and another again in the evening at 8 o'clock when gleaning must cease. We are now standing at Melton's only granary, and as you can see, if we can get the camera to move in above the lintel, you'll see RH being Robert Hill, 1767. It's very nice, it has got a charm about it, and I do sincerely hope that one day something is done about it to maintain it for posterity. A first class quiz question, which one sees quite often in the public houses of Melton Mowbray nowadays, is to ask which side of the Lady Wilton Bridge was widened. The answer is, of course, it's the side of the Remembrance Gardens, and it all happened in 1930, as will be seen here. The bridge widened by Melton Mowbray Urban District Council, obviously to take the increase in traffic flow. Another rarely seen little sign here concerns a benefactor or part benefactor of the bridge itself. This arch was erected at the expense of the Right Honourable Robert, Earl of Harborough in 1775. It's a nice bridge. Problem is, the traffic will keep hitting it. Now there we go, the Edgerton Lodge, the home of the Wiltons. And at one time of day their front garden was all of this, the Edgerton Park as well as this part here. And they own the back where we have the Wilton Road bus station now. And the Earl of Wilton would stand in that front room there, that front centre projecting room, and he would say to his guests, "What do you think of this then?" He'd say, "Oh, I think that's fantastic. I can see the lawns run straight down into the river." So he said, "Ha ha, you're wrong there. There's a wall." And this is the wall here. And of course, it's called a ha-ha wall. I know, I helped build it. We're now located at Kettleby Lock. This is the last double lock before one reaches Melton Mowbray. Now, due to the very heavy demand for transportation of goods created by the ever increasing output of the Industrial Revolution, remember we were a great inventive nation at the time and we needed badly to export goods to the ports of England, and the roads at the time were in a very, very poor state. Hence the canal era. And they set about producing canals or navigations built by navvies, as the name implies, linking the great rivers of the Mersey, the Severn, the Thames and the Humber. In all, there was something like 6,800 kilometres of canal opened, with Birmingham City being at the centre of the hub of industry. Now we see it's fallen into a ruinous state, and hopefully it will all be opened again, certainly within the next 10 years. What concerns us mostly in Melton Mowbray for its economic